So those who would propose a new domestic terrorism statute, the arguments, they come up in a couple of different flavors, and I think that they're all arguments that are worthy of some consideration. And the first one is that there's really nothing on the books right now that has broad applicability with respect to domestic terrorism in the United States. There are statutes that are directed more at international terrorism, although some of them can be applied domestically. In fact, when I was U.S. Attorney, we were able to successfully charge someone with providing material support to terrorism and a hate crime for actions that were directed at a synagogue in Toledo. So the fact that there's no current law, there are cases that could fall through the cracks. You wouldn't be able to prosecute on the federal level. A second follow-on argument in favor of a federal domestic terrorism statute, one that I think actually deserves maybe a little bit more thought, is that because we have this gap, because we don't have a federal domestic terrorism statute, you've had all the states rush in to try to fill the vacuum with varying degrees of success. Some states have a domestic terrorism statute or a statute that would apply to domestic terrorism that has real concerns about whether it's on the sentencing front or whether it's on the elements of the offense, just statutes that maybe you wouldn't think are very well done. And a federal statute might be able to come into place and take away some of the oxygen from these other state movements and provide a basis for federal prosecutors to pursue some of these cases with a federal domestic terrorism statute. A third reason why there's some movement for this, it's an issue of prioritization of resources. And that may not sound like a reason to put a new federal statute on the books, but those who advocate in favor of a domestic terrorism statute would say, if you have a statute that's devoted to punishing domestic terrorism, and you're very careful about the way that that's crafted, that statute, by virtue of it existing, will give additional impetus to investigative agencies like the Federal Bureau of Investigation or U.S. Attorney's offices or the National Security Division at DOJ, give them additional impetus to use that statute. And that does have a trickle-down effect in terms of prioritizing domestic terrorism cases out of each individual field office of the FBI, each individual U.S. Attorney's office. It also might make a difference in terms of resourcing. Personnel who are devoted to identifying, investigating, and prosecuting domestic terrorism cases. So in terms of what the statute would look like, what I've seen and what I'm aware of are statutes that are very much devoted at conduct as opposed to like membership or group affiliation. And I think that's really where, if people are going to talk about the need for a domestic terrorism statute, that's where the consensus exists. That you have to focus on trying to identify conduct that's directed at political violence, conspiracies of people who are directed at the same kind of actions, and then underlying that, how do they propose going about engaging in political violence? Is it using firearms? Is it using explosives? These are the most typical ones that we see, but also kidnapping, murder, threats. These are all types of conduct that would be folded up under whatever this statute would look like. It's different, and this is an important point too, because it's different than at least one of the material support statutes that's in place that's used primarily against international terrorism subjects. There's a statute that prohibits providing aid or comfort or any sort of assistance to groups, designated groups by the Secretary of State. And these are foreign terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah. They're called designated foreign terrorist organizations, and there's a statute that specifically prohibits providing any kind of material support or assistance to those organizations. Nothing like that is contemplated, as far as I'm aware, seriously contemplated on the domestic front because of the First Amendment, and because there is such a strong interplay between domestic politics and the First Amendment and affiliation with domestic political groups. It really would be constitutionally problematic to try to employ that same model that's used in the foreign policy and international terrorism space to try to use that in the domestic space. I think would not get very far. And that does address many of the concerns that we hear about a domestic terrorism statute. I think if people are contemplating that it would punish membership or group affiliation, they have greater concerns about it, and for obvious reasons. This is not the first time in American history that the need for a domestic terrorism statute has been discussed. This conversation has taken place over at least the past couple decades, and it ebbs and flows depending on what's going on in the country. Proponents of it today could be opponents of it tomorrow. It really just depends on who's proposing it. And it's a very serious step. So I think there needs to be very careful consideration and absolutely consensus around, if there was going to be a movement towards a domestic terrorism statute, bipartisan consensus on the need for it, and more importantly, what that statute looks like, because that will drive how it's implemented and how it's executed in each of the federal law enforcement agencies.